rye was the first whiskey of America, but before you had whiskey in America, you had rum production. So a lot of the first settlers that got to America, they would have settled in places like New York, like Boston, like anywhere on the eastern seaboard. And because there was access to the sea, you had a huge amount of, the sugar trade was going through there, and you had a huge amount of rum production being done. As people moved closer, sort of more inland, you had the price of molasses going up drastically, and also the price of grains reducing. So it made sense that people, when they got into Pennsylvania, would start cultivating grains like rye, like corn, and like wheat, and start distilling those. So Mikta's can trace its roots back to one of this first whiskey distilleries that was called Schenk's. It was from a little town in Pennsylvania called Schaefferstown. Now, the Schenk family, they distilled rye grains there and made single barrel rye whiskey to a really, really high standard. It's been said that George Washington actually bought a lot of rye whiskey from this distillery, and they used it during the winter at Valley Forge to actually fortify the troops. So, this was basically one of the whiskeys that helped beat the British. So I'm not sure
fortifying myself.
Exactly.
Right now.
So yeah, we should look upon it less favorably, because this is the reason we lost the war. So the Schenk family, they distilled rye grain in this little distillery in Schaefferstown, and they kept the distillery for 100 or so years. And then they sold it to a Dutch Pennsylvania family called Bomberger. And then the Bomberger family took over and did very much the same thing. So Michter's actually release yearly, basically a legacy release, one called Bomberger's and one called Schenk's. It kind of looks back to that heritage of whiskey. So Bomberger took over in the sort of 1850s, and they had the distillery until the end of Prohibition. Now, if you were an American whiskey distiller and you just lived through Prohibition, you were probably not in a particularly good place financially. And the Bomberger family decided to get rid of the distillery. And it changed hands a lot throughout the next sort of 20, 30 years. People in America weren't drinking that much whiskey. It was very difficult to regain the stocks that had been lost during Prohibition. And no one was really willing to take a gamble. Products like rums and vodkas were a lot easier to produce. And this was a really difficult time for the industry. So any spirits that needed to be aged and couldn't be sold kind of straight off the bat, this was a really tricky time. Now, eventually, the Bomberger distillery got sold to a gentleman called Lou Foreman. And he bucked the trend here. He didn't just name the distillery Foreman's distillery like Schenk's and Bomberger's did. He actually named it after his sons, Michael and Peter. Now, this is where the name Michter's comes from. It's the M-I-C-H from Michael, and then the T-E-R from Peter. So it's not an old kind of Germanic name or anything like that. It's just a portmanteau of those two names. So Lou Foreman starts distilling really high quality whiskey throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think globally, there was a real kind of excitement about whiskey production in this time. Prohibition was gone. You had lots and lots of daring distilleries creating some of the best distillates that we've ever seen before today anyway. And there was this real sort of quality control at Michter's. They had a saying called cost be damned. And throughout the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, these were one of the premium bourbons and sort of sour mash whiskeys that were coming out of Pennsylvania. Now, unfortunately, we have a gentleman called Tom Cruise to blame, making cosmopolitans and mojitos and all those cocktails with light spirits that led to the demise of, globally, the whiskey industry. The 80s and 90s were a really, really difficult time, for American whiskey, for Irish whiskey, for Scotch whiskey, for Japanese whiskey, all the Japanese whiskeys that sell for thousands of pounds a bottle these days. That was almost completely ripped apart by this kind of whiskey decline. And unfortunately, Michter's as a distillery had to be mothballed and shut down due to bankruptcy in 1989. Now, the family that owned it, they didn't really want anything to do with it anymore. And they decided that, they were just going to leave the distillery as it is, and it would have been lost to history. No one would have heard of Michter's, currently today, if it wasn't for the current owners of Michter's. So the current owners are the Magliocco family. So Joseph Magliocco is the president, and he knew Michter's from when it was being made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And when he was bartending his way through law school, Michter's was his favorite whiskey, and he used it in his Manhattans, in his old fashions, all the drinks that he made for his customers. And all of a sudden, the supply of Michter's dries up, and he's kind of thinking, all right, what's going on? So he looked into it. He approached the family and asked if he could buy the trademark for the name off them. And they sold it to him for $245. And this was kind of the start of the resurrection of the Michter's brand. So the distillery in Pennsylvania was closed. You know, if you wanted to be a serious contender in the bourbon category and the rye category, it's a really good move to Kentucky, to the heartland of bourbon.
Yep.
You'll know all about this, Rick, obviously. So, you know, Kentucky has an amazing source for water. So it sits on a limestone shelf. So it's fantastic, clear water, pure water that's iron-free for whiskey production. You've also got all the coopers in the land that, you know, live there and make barrels there. You've also got all the best distillers and all the best distillery workers in that area too, plus a really great climate and a real sense of camaraderie throughout the industry. So Michter's shifted production from Pennsylvania and moved to a little suburb just outside Louisville called Shively. Now, it wasn't quite as easy as just getting the trademark and then, you know, sell whiskey. It's not quite that simple. It's not step one, trademark, step two, whiskey, step three, profit. There's a lot of moving parts in the middle of that. And Michter's realized that the name had almost become forgotten. So they needed to get whiskey into people's hands of a really high quality as quickly as possible. So in the early 90s, Joe Magliocco and his mentor was a gentleman called Dick Newman, who was at Austin Nichols, a Wild Turkey distillery for a long time. They decided they would go to all of their, you know, friends' distilleries and, you know, they'd help out the distilleries by buying whiskey from them, but they were also buying the best possible quality whiskey that Michter's could get their hands on. So whiskeys that they'd sample and say, this has a similar flavor profile to the old style of Michter's. And of course, the distilleries were more than happy to sell because this was the early 90s. Whiskey was still in a really troubling spot. So any income these distilleries could get was, you know, gold. So this was how Michter's started. They started bottling other distilleries' whiskey, like an independent bottler does. So like Gordon MacPhail, Douglas Lang, Elements of Islay, Porterskeg, basically doing what an indie bottler does, purchasing barrels of whiskey, making sure they were of exceptional quality and exceptional age, and then bottling them under the Michter's brand name. So that was phase one. That got some money in the bank. And then phase two was where they went in with their full distillation team, their recipes, their grains, their barrels, and they basically borrowed other people's distilleries. You know, this was getting towards, you know, the early 2000s. A lot of bourbon distilleries were still only operating 6 months out of the year. So the other 6 months, the distilleries were there to just, you know, do whatever you wanted to. So Michter's went in using their equipment, their recipes, made their whiskey, and then bottled it. So this, or then barreled it and then aged it. So this is phase two of Michter's. And then the final phase, when they had enough money in the bank again, was to set up this distillery in Louisville, Kentucky, or just outside Louisville. And this is where all Michter's is now being distilled. And in the next few years, we'll see, you know, production shift to all the bottles will be 100% from this distillery. Now, that's kind of a brief history of Michter's, but I always think that the history is really, really important to set the scene, but also what do Michter's do that makes their whiskeys different? How do Michter's, you know, get their bourbons to taste like that bourbon? How do they get their ryes to be that light and that delicate? And the approach that the current owners of Michter's currently use is the same approach that they used in the previous distillery up in Pennsylvania, and that is cost be damned. They use the finest ingredients. They will actually send away a huge amount of corn and rye and grains that doesn't meet their exacting specification. They will use the best equipment possible. They've got bits of equipment that might make the whiskey 0.005% better, and it costs a fortune, but they will do it because their strive is to produce the best quality American whiskey possible. So for example, if we take the bourbon that you guys have got here, hopefully smoking with your nice cigar. So the Michter's small batch bourbon. Now we've got 4 Michter's products that we're going to taste today. Obviously we'll jump back and forth between cigars and whiskey. It's not just going to be me for an hour and a half, which is definitely a good thing. But every whiskey that we've got today it's very similar in its ethos. So the quality is in every single one of these bottles. They retail for all the same price, and the care and attention to detail is exactly the same across all of them. What we're switching here predominantly is the type of grains that are used, and in the last whiskey, it's the type of barrels that are used. So in terms of how Michter's use that cost be damned approach, Michter's have sort of, you know, during their production stages, they have a few things that they do which are not proprietary. They're not things that no one else knows about. They're not things that no one else could do, but they are things which cost a bit more money. And they're things that a company that, say, isn't family owned, that has a lot of shareholders that are demanding dividends and profits, wouldn't be able to do, because, you know, time constraints and money constraints would be a real issue here. So Joe Magliocco, the president, has always said that, you know, if he was in charge of a bigger corporation, he'd have been fired on day one, because they will not release the whiskies until they are absolutely ready. So in terms of just some of the production processes that all of these whiskies go through, the first thing is, when we talk about American whiskey, there's a huge amount of legislation, especially on rye and bourbon. It's a really well-protected industry. Now, one of the things that comes up the most is the aging process. So you have to use new charred oak containers. So if you don't use a new charred oak container, then you can't call your product a bourbon or a rye. If you want to, you know, add coloring or anything like that, that also means that you can't call it a bourbon and a rye. So the only thing you're allowed to add after maturation is water. So your barrel is responsible for 100% of the flavor, oh, sorry, not the flavor, of the color of your whiskey, and a very, very large amount of the flavor as well. That's not to say that you can put in a really bad quality distillate and hope to cover it up with barrel. If you put garbage in, you get garbage out, you know, that old adage. But if you start with amazing quality liquid, really good quality barrel, then it's pretty much a guarantee that your whiskey should come out tasting delicious. So the wood for the barrel is arguably the most costly part of Mikta's production. So the first thing is they get their wood chopped down from the trees, and then they need to make that into barrels. Now, unfortunately, that brand new wood is really bad for making barrels. It's full of sap and chlorophyll and lots of water and lots of bitterness and astringency. So if we were to just turn those planks of wood straight into barrels and then put whiskey in, you're going to get a very bitter product. So most distilleries would kind of say, okay, let's put these in an oven and let's kiln dry them, because that's a really quick way of doing things. But that doesn't get rid of all of those bitter notes. It actually concentrates the bitter notes a lot, because you're not giving the wood time to naturally get rid of all of these components. So when Michters talk about their barrels, every single barrel is air dried outside. The staves for the barrels, air dried outside for between 18 months and up to 5 years sometimes. Now, This is called open air seasoning. It's very expensive to do, especially with, you know, lumber cost in the US right now at an all-time high. But this seasoning of the wood, it basically allows the wood to go through all of the seasons, hence the name. So in the winter, it gets wet and cold and kind of shrinks up, which forces a lot of these kind of bad astringent characters out of the wood. In the summer, it gets baked and it kind of opens up a lot of the pores and it'll dry that wood out. So after it's gone through these seasons a few times, the wood is full of the best components, the best sugars, and all of the right lignins and lactones that we really want to be imparted into the whiskey. Now, I know this might sound like something that, you know, it's not that important, but for Michters, this is kind of the DNA of the barrel. If we started with a sub-quality piece of wood to form the barrel, you're only going to decline in quality from there. So the barrels are all done like this. They're all air dried outside. And then before they're charred, which is the legal regulation for bourbons and ryes, they're actually toasted beforehand as well. Now, this is something that other distilleries do. It's something that most sort of French wine companies do. A lot of Californian wineries do this as well. And it's used especially in cognacs and armagnacs and things like that. So the toasting of the barrel, it's very different to the charring process. I always kind of liken this process to, imagine I give you a piece of bread and I give you a toaster and a blowtorch. Now, if I say make toast, make me something delicious and toasty that's not burnt, it's really difficult to do that with a blowtorch. The blowtorch is going to char it really quickly. It's going to carbonize it and make it really black. That's charring. Toasting, a much more delicate heat over a longer period of time. And this is really, really important to the flavor compounds we get from Michters, but also it's really important for the barrel chemistry. So when we talk about the toasting process, essentially, we've got the blowtorch ready.
We're ready.
So the barrel essentially is made up of all of these tiny little holes called pores, and inside those pores are lots and lots of sugars and lots of goodness. And those pores would have been used for the tree to get its nutrients. Now, if we just charred the barrel, we would caramelize all the sugars on the inside of the barrel, but we wouldn't penetrate as deep into the wood as we do when we toast. So when we toast, the pores in the wood actually open up and they create resin channels which go much, much deeper. So the whiskey is then able to penetrate far deeper into the wood, getting at more of the sugars, more of the good stuff that we want to come into the whiskey. So this is kind of one of the key things that, Michters use amazing quality wood and also the toasting process before the charring of the barrel. So those are kind of key things that they do across all of the range. And then when it comes to the bourbon specifically, which is what we're drinking first. Now the bourbon on the front of the bottle, it says small batch bourbon. Now, I remember when I first started drinking bourbon, small batch was a real buzzword in the industry. And kind of looked into it and I was like, oh, it's a small batch. It must be good. It must be from a really small number of barrels. There's no way people would ever lie on their bottles or anything like that. But small batch actually has no legal definition. So, for example, a big distillery like Jack Daniels could put small batch on their labels. And this is nothing against Jack Daniels. They're certainly not a small batch company. It's amazing to see them be that consistent at that level, but they're certainly not small batch. So when Michters say small batch, and Michters, by the way, only ever release products that are either single barrel or small batch, the biggest batch size that Michters will use is 20 full barrels of whiskey. So any 20 full barrels is the biggest batch size on here.
Oh my God. Okay. So, I did not even know that. That's amazing.
Each barrel is worth 5% of the overall product. And the reason they do it, it's to make themselves be more consistent. If one barrel is 5%, and if you've got that in one bad barrel in your batch, it's not going to cut it. Whereas if you say make your batch is 200 barrels, then each barrel is worth 0.5%. And if you scale up even further, it goes down to 2,000 barrels in a batch, which some distilleries are probably doing. But Michters will always say that 20 barrels, full barrels maximum. And they have marrying tanks which literally only fit enough to hold 20 full barrels. So small batch bourbon, it's a product of 20 barrels of Michters bourbon. So this one's
barrels. How many barrels a year do they do?
In terms of full capacity, it's a very good question. It's one that I don't know the exact answer for because I'm not sure exactly what's happened during the COVID year.
Okay, I was just curious.
I can find out for you. I can definitely get the information across at some point. But yes, so this is Michter's kind of bourbon. So it's the US #1 small batch bourbon. This is 45.7% ABV. So it's slightly higher, slightly punchier than some of the other bourbons you might see on the market. A lot of them sit around 40% ABV or 80 proof. This one's got a little bit more kind of bite to it, a bit more strength, a bit more punch, but it's still beautifully smooth. And if you notice the woods that are used in this, really, really kind of elegant, soft note. It's not really spicy. It's really well integrated and really well balanced.
Perfect. Thank you. Rick, over to you.
Okay. Wow. The history of your company is just beautiful to listen to. I enjoyed that thoroughly because I've been drinking Michters for a while. A friend of mine introduced me 4 years ago, and I've always had it in my cabinet in some form or another. I prefer the rye, but I'll tell a little bit about our company. Phillips and King. Well, let me start. Ventura Cigar is a subsidiary of Phillips and King, which is a California company. They started 120 years ago as a candy distributor and tobacco distributor in Pasadena, California. And they moved up to Moore Park, California, many, many, many years ago. But they quickly became deeply involved in premium cigar distribution. And they found out that was really their love and where the money was for the company. So they went on distributing cigars for, 100 years. Every brand, every style, including Davidoff. Thank you, Roy. And have developed some of the strongest relationships with cigar manufacturers worldwide of any company I've ever seen. I mean, I'm amazed. I've been there almost 11 years now, and I'm amazed at the relationships we have with cigar manufacturers. So as a distributor, we sell everybody cigars. We take them, put them in a box, ship them to customers all over the United States and Virgin Islands and now the world. one thing that we always wanted to do was have our own brands. I mean, we sell everyone else's, why not have our own cigars? So we started dipping our toes in that pond, and we developed lots of brands. And I guess in 2011, and Patrick Hurd, Roy, you know Patrick. Patrick Hurd, who was our chief sales officer for a long time, and Sergio Montalvo and Kevin Newman, who were all at P&K at the time, decided that they were going to develop a cigar that was new and fresh and clean, and not a heritage brand like our fathers and grandfathers brand, but still have that same quality. So they came up with the brand first. And if you look at PSyKo, everybody's got the PSyKo wrapper in front of them. It's PS, little y, big K, little O. If you look at that, the P stands for Patrick, the S for Sergio, Y is and the K is for Kevin. And I guess one day in a meeting, they were just talking about, this is how it's been told to me. They were just writing it down, and they looked at it and they said, oh my God, let's do PSyKo. I think they probably went initially with psych, like our kids say, and then backed up and said, no, let's do PSyKo. And the brand was born that way. Now, the task after that was, who are we going to have make this cigar? And we have these great relationships with manufacturers all over. Who's going to do the cigar? And I guess Davidoff won out due to their superior quality, their manufacturing consistency, and the fact that Henke Kellner took an interest in this brand as a blender is just beyond me. Henke and Patrick worked on the blend for a while, and actually, it's the same today. We have not changed it since. It's a fantastic cigar, and we attribute a lot of the success to the quality manufacturing standards that Davidoff holds down in the Dominican Republic at Tabadon. So, what we're looking to do is just bring a well-priced cigar, quality made, tastes great, made by a wonderful company to the rest of the world. It's been in the U.S. for a while. We now just need to put it in more people's hands. How many people on this board, show of hands, this is your first PSyKo? Now give me a this or this. Yeah. I mean, oh, Paul, what are you doing, Paul? But I'm telling you, I mean, for the price, you can't beat it. I mean, the issue. Go ahead, Paul.
No, it's certainly not my first one.
I know.
I smoked plenty of them. We did the launch last year, and it's been a great success here in the UK. So,
well, I love hearing that, and I'm so pissed off at COVID because I held one event. I think I'm patient X. I think I brought COVID to the UK because I was sick. I was feeling sick at our event, Roy. But I powered through, and then by the time I got to Germany, I was just like sick.
I think it was the espresso martinis more than anything.
It may have been. That could have had something to do with it. But I mean, we started with, initially we went with the Toro, the Maduro and the Natural first. And if you look at the brand, it's PSyKo 7, right? This was a play. We used 7 different tobaccos from 7 different countries. The only thing that the filler is 5. And that's a proprietary blend that is different for each cigar in different varying quantities. You have different tobaccos to create that particular blend. The one thing that changes is the binder and wrapper with each of the cigars. The countries are Dominican Republic, of course, Ecuador, Peru, Mexico, Honduras, U.S., and Sumatra. So you have all 7 of those tobaccos in every one of these cigars in varying quantities. Just like I'm smoking, I moved over to the Connecticut Gordo 6x60. Oh, I'm out. That's the problem with talking too much. But anybody have any questions about the brand? I mean, I can just talk about silly things for a while, but you guys may have questions.
I think how did the approach to Davidoff come about? You said you had multiple people who you talked to, and but you eventually Davidoff kind of won the listing.
Truly, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I could probably find out from Patrick, but one thing that I do know is that there's probably 3 companies that we have fantastic relationships with. Davidoff is one of those 3. I mean, they're top 3 that we've done business with and sell cigars for. And I assume, and I've heard this said, that we went with Davidoff because of their attention to detail and quality. And the fact that Henke Kellner was going to do the blend. I mean, you can't go wrong.
For sure. So what? When you had the name PSyKo, the 7 then came from the 7 different tobaccos.
Yep.
So did you give Henke Kellner any guidelines? You said we wanted to be 7 different tobaccos, or?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, of course. We did say 7 tobaccos. That was the only guideline. And then he took it and ran with it. And I think there was one when Patrick got his samples back, he had one change, and that was it. And that was it. We were done. The brand was born.
And how did the rest of the branding come about? So did you normally in your social media or your advertising, you have a lot of crows going about?
Yeah,
also you got kind of got the recipe on the label. So how did that all come about?
I mean, you look at a lot of cigar boxes nowadays, especially the higher end premium cigar boxes. I mean, they're wooden. They have the banding. The bands on the cigars are really old school. They're very ornate. We wanted something that was fresher, like an iPhone. Something cleaner looking, just white. As far as the crows go, I don't know. We just wanted something cool. I mean, every time we start a new marketing campaign, we try and play on lots of different things, like Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, and dark imagery and fun and light and psycho crazy things. Because while we want our fathers and grandfathers to smoke this cigar because of its quality and taste and construction and the fact that it's priced right, we also want to attract younger demographics, 18 and over. In the U.S. now it's 21 and over in a lot of states. So we want to make sure that we're appealing to them, because we're seeing a resurgence of cigars, pipe, nasal snuff, lots of things in younger demographics. They're trying different modalities of tobacco instead of just cigarettes. So we want to make sure that we're keeping that young, fresh edge to reach out and touch these people as well.
Okay. So as I just mentioned, the big label is kind of a recipe book. And it kind of links into the normal band, which is Medicate Your Mind.
Yeah.
You guys put quite a lot of thought into the entire branding process.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, Medicate Your Mind, is just what the doctor ordered. Right? I mean, because we all live crazy, wild lives. I mean, each of us have kids and jobs, and of course I'm doing my job now. But we all have these things that stress us. What better way to relax and unwind than smoke a cigar and have a drink with friends, family, and just chill.
Yeah,
I don't know.
absolutely.
What do you guys say in the UK for just chill?
Relax.
Relax. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We use that word a lot also.
It doesn't have to be too complicated.
No, right?
Nathan, you want to talk us to the second sample bottle? Well,
Absolutely. Yeah, so next up we'll go with the rye whiskey. And I know there's a couple of questions on sour mash versus bourbon. I will obviously get to that when we talk about the sour mash. But for now, we'll focus on the rye. Now, the rye is a very kind of historic American style of whiskey. A lot of the first ryes that would have been made would have been, the grains might have been brought over by immigrants. American whiskey is very much like an amalgamation of lots of different countries' distilling histories and drinking cultures all together. America is Irish and Scottish and French and German and Polish, and each one of these countries had a really distinct drinking culture. But the things they all agreed on was the type of grain that you'd use to make spirit, whether it be vodka, whether it be beer, whether it be whiskey. And rye was a grain that you could use a lot. And it's also much, much hardier than corn. Corn likes warm climates like Kentucky. It doesn't really grow much further north than Kentucky. Occasionally in the Midwest, you get some really big corn harvests. But for the most part, rye was the grain, especially around Pennsylvania, New York, and Canada as well. Rye was the grain that everyone had. So this became America's first sort of whiskey. Now, in comparison to the bourbon whiskey that we had first, there's a couple of laws which are very, very similar, but the key law that's different is the mash bill, the recipe. So to be a bourbon, you have to be a minimum of 51% corn in your mash bill. You can then use flavoring grains or grains which have enzymes. So, a generic mash bill, Michters don't discuss their mash bill, so I don't actually know it. But like a generic mash bill would be something along the lines of 70% corn, 20% rye, and then malted barley or wheat is also used quite commonly, is that kind of final element. And those grains give, corn gives you structure and butteriness and a really kind of rich texture. Rye gives you sharper, spicy flavors, a bit more green notes, a bit more kind of dill and eucalyptus. And then the reason that malted barley and wheat are in there is to kickstart the fermentation. Rye and corn are both really, really lazy grains. They need extra enzymes added to them for them to ferment. But what the American whiskey industry realized was that if you add a little bit of malted barley, those enzymes are naturally occurring in malted barley. Things like proamylase and maltose and things like that, which will kickstart the fermentation. So that's your bourbon whiskeys. Now, rye whiskeys, they follow all the same rules and regulations, apart from the fact it's 51% rye. But more recently, rye whiskeys have been getting higher and higher rye contents. There's a few reasons for that. Like in the UK 10 years ago, you had maybe 2 ryes that you could buy. One of them was Canadian Club. And if you were lucky, you might find a bottle of Pikesville, or if you were really lucky, a bottle of Rittenhouse. So rye whiskey just never really came to the UK. But then all of a sudden, people started watching Mad Men. Classic cocktails become a really big thing. Don Draper likes his rye Manhattan and his rye Old Fashioned. And so people like me, I'll admit it, were going into places like the Whiskey Exchange and asking for rye whiskey. Loads of really puzzled looks, being like, why on earth do you want this like 12-pounder bottle of rye whiskey? This is way before Michter's was in the market. And all of a sudden, these American distillers, which hadn't been making rye for a really long time, they had a wake-up call. They're like, right, people are demanding rye. So a lot of distillers, craft distillers, saw a gap in the market, and they ended up getting or sourcing their rye whiskey from a place called MGP in Indiana, which was amazing quality, food-grade rye whiskey, but it was 95% rye. So rye in the UK for a long time became this really spicy, really bold rye whiskey it was basically like really peppery, a little bit kind of yeasty and bready, but it was all quite young as well. And I'd never really tasted, the old style of rye, the way that rye used to be made pre-Prohibition, and the Kentucky style of rye. So
I don't think I would like it.
It's.
I mean, 95% rye. That sounds whoa.
It's really spicy. Yeah, it's and also because it's quite young and quite 50% ABV, 55% ABV. You had this amazing sort of straight off the bat. You had all of these yeasty flavors coming out, and it was interesting. But it wasn't what I would say was traditional rye the way it used to be. Yeah. So this is where Michter's came about. I mean, they looked at the old recipes that would have been made by the Michter's distillery, and also looking back at Schenks and Bombergers. And, you know, rye whiskey has to be 51% rye, but it can also have, you know, 51% rye and 49% corn if you wanted it to. So Michters have a lower rye content in their mash bill. It's still more than 51%, but it's definitely got a large amount of corn in there as well. And that corn gives you the sweetness. So what you've got is a really rich texture that you wouldn't normally find in a rye that's, say, made of 95% rye. But you do also have this really nice green, not quite, you know, black pepper note, but white pepper, eucalyptus, dill, mint. And that's kind of the Michter's house style here. It's a really rich texture on the palate. But then because of the rye grain being toned down a little bit by the quite sort of bullish corn, what you end up with is a beautifully smooth rye. Now, I always think this is a rye to sip on. It's fantastic in Manhattans and old fashions and all of those kinds of cocktails, but it is amazing sip neat as well. And this was something that, especially in the UK, it didn't exist. If you drank, you know, Pikesville, it was normally in a Manhattan, or it was, you know, as a whiskey in a shot. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they weren't these elegant sipping ryes that the Michter's brings. And so,
well, normally, Nathan, can I interrupt? Normally when people mix a bourbon or a whiskey, it's because the flavor neat is not great. And what I've found with the, Michter's rye, and like I said earlier, I'm not a rye fan. Michter's rye is great, neat. It is fantastic, and it goes very well. The mild spiciness it has goes very well with like a natural or a Maduro cigar.
That was my next question to you. How is it with the tasting? Has anyone got any sort of questions or comments about the cigar pairings?
Go.
If not, we'll revisit towards the end.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's all good. I know what it's like. If we've only had 2 drams, people are a little bit more shy on camera. After 4, it's a lot better.
That's right.
So, Sam, you got a question there? No, he's just putting his hand up. Right. So
sorry, I couldn't unmute. It wasn't a question. It was just the pairing. The spice of the cigar melts so well because the low content, the sweetness in the rye. It just kind of binds with it. It is fantastic pairing. The rye, I think, works so well with it.
What are you smoking?
I'm smoking the Maduro.
Ah, the Maduro. That I love the wrapper on the Maduro. That Mexican San Andreas wrapper. If when just aged for a little while, like if you buy your box, put it in your humidor for a month, and don't touch it. Yes, it'll develop sugars. That wrapper is so sweet. Sometimes when I pick up especially on the Gordo, maybe because there's more wrapper surface area, it is very, very sweet. It pairs well with any bourbon, a rye, because it does smoke a little spicy, and especially rum.
Paul, I'll see you in Liverpool, yeah?
Yeah.
Great. I mean, I'm really upset that I can't actually smoke my cigars inside. My girlfriend is away, so I could probably get away with it, but she's back tomorrow morning, so I'm not sure I could get it all out by then.
Don't chance it.
Yeah, definitely not worth it. It's not worth it.
Better be safe than sorry.
Yeah.
But so the rye, it gets put into the same barrels as the bourbon, so you'll always find that house style going across all of Michter's whiskey, so that really kind of rich, buttery texture, really elegant and balanced flavor. Yeah. But the rye here is a single barrel. Now, one of the questions that we get most often when we're talking about Michter's is, how do you keep a single barrel consistent? And the honest answer is, there is no way you can keep a single barrel consistent. It doesn't matter whether you take the same wood from the same trees and the same cooper makes the same specification barrel and you fill it with distillate from that same day and put it next to each other in the warehouse, those whiskeys will taste fundamentally different. Now, that's a real sort of art when it comes to the maturation of the whiskey. So this means that every bottle of Michter's rye has the potential to be different from the last. But the quality of the team in charge of the distillation and the maturation mean that they know exactly when to release the rye to be that Michter's house style. Now, for me, the Michter's house style on the rye, there is a flavor note that you find in rye whiskey, especially when it's in toasted charred barrels, that only appears for a really short window between the sort of 5 and 8 year mark. And it's that really kind of minty eucalyptus green note that you can find on the rye. Now, some ryes, I think, especially high rye content, you get dill pickle and those sorts of flavors. But for me, with Michter's, it's that very fresh green eucalyptus foresty note. Now, when Michter's spot that, when they're doing their tastings, their samplings, they know that that rye has become a Michter's rye. So all these whiskeys are sort of between 5 and 8 years old. Obviously, the bourbon, the batch could be 5-year-old bourbon up to 8, 9, 10-year-old bourbon sometimes. But with the single barrel, the rye ranges from that 5 to 8-year-old mark because they need to find that specific flavor point to be like, right, this is how Michter's should taste. This is when the rye is mature. There's no age statements on these bottles, even though they could if they wanted to, especially with the single barrel. It would mean printing a lot of extra labels because you're only getting about, 250 bottles out of a single barrel. So you're only printing 250 labels at a time. But everything that Michter's are doing with this rye, it's meant to be an homage to the original distillers in Pennsylvania from 1753. Rye was a single barrel product, and if it was good enough for George Washington and his men beating the English, then it's good enough for us to drink on a Thursday evening now. Now, it's a slightly lower ABV. It's 42.4% in comparison to the bourbon at 45.7. And the honest answer as to why it's that way, it's the ABV it tasted best. Compared to 42.3 and 42.5, this was the sweet spot. So 42.4 was just the level of sweetness compared to, bite that you wanted. And that's how they decided to label it. So it's one of my personal favorite rye whiskeys.
Mine as well. I have a question, though.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm a bourbon snob and I have a pretty good collection of bourbon. I am constantly on the lookout for special releases, things like that by distillers. And I'm wondering, does Michter's ever do a special release?
There is annual special releases from Michter's. So there's normally a release of a 10-year-old bourbon and a 10-year-old rye every year. So the bourbon might be released twice a year, depending on stock allocation. There is annual releases called Schenks and Bombergers as well. So again, an homage to those sort of legacy and heritage brands. So those are very, very limited releases. And that's where the team gets a little bit more experimental. So they'll use different types of American oak, something like chinkapin oak, which has got more of a toasty characteristic to it. So there's those.
Paul is showing out over here.
10 years old.
Thanks,
10-year-old rye.
I can't find it. I would love to have it.
I think it's probably easier to find it in the UK than the US these days.
Yeah, I can't find that one.
It's the rye, if it does get released, it's not a guarantee every year, but the rye, we don't get a lot of bottles in the UK, and it does get snapped up instantly. And the good thing about Michter's, not a lot of it ends up on auction websites. The people that buy Michter's really enjoy it for the fact that they can drink it. There's a lot of whiskeys that come from the US, which, the likes of the Pappy Van Winkles and things like that, not a lot of people are opening those to enjoy them. Those are going on an auction site and then sold, which is fair enough. If that's what people want to do. But yeah, there are limited releases from Michter's. If you're very lucky, you might be able to find a 20-year bourbon or a 25-year bourbon or a 25-year rye. They get released very sporadically in tiny, tiny batches. And then there's the toasted range as well, which is normally a yearly release, which is the US #1 range essentially gets finished in toasted but not charred barrels, which just adds a nice kind of different dimension to the whiskeys. So there are lots of special releases, but you do have to be quick, especially in the US, because there's never enough to go around.
Thanks. Every time my liquor store, they have a standing order. Anytime they get rye, Michter's, they have to call me and tell me, and I come down and I buy it.
I'm going to put you in touch with the guys at the distillery. If you go down to Fort Nelson,
I will.
Then they've got a lot of the stuff that they'll sell, like distillery exclusive releases there too. So you can get a barrel strength bourbon. If you speak to the guys, you'll be able to definitely kind of find out when the limited releases are coming. And, Michter's, it's a Kentucky company. They're always going to look after the home state.
The local.
I'm 2.5 hours from them.
Oh, it's a 5-hour round trip. It's fine. It's worth it.
I will drive. I have business. I can do business down there. I can do business.
smoking cigars at the distillery is definitely business.
That's right.
We had a question come in earlier, Nathan. What's the practical difference between the sour mash and bourbon except ABV? Surely both are sour mashed.
Excellent question. Yeah. So I guess if you finished the rye, we could definitely kind of discuss the sour mash now. Or if you're still on the rye, we'll just kind of talk through the sour mash. So yeah, the sour mash whiskey, 99% of American bourbons and ryes will go through the process that we call the sour mash process. And the reason for that is, when we're talking about whiskies from the UK, we've been making whiskey in the UK for probably nearly 1,000 years. We've been fermenting beers in the UK for 5,000 years. So we know what works and what doesn't in fermentation. Now, and it's the same in Poland, in Germany, in Greece, in Spain, in France, whenever these people got to America, they had to basically relearn the art of fermentation. They had to figure out what worked, which trees were going to be, inoculated with the right yeasts, what grains were there going to be, and all of these kinds of things. So imagine that you're a settler and you used to make beer or you used to make whiskey back in England or in Scotland or in Ireland. So you get to America, you get to Kentucky, you buy some grain, and then you're like, right, okay, I'm also going to take a barrel of whiskey with me wherever I'm going because it's probably going to be dark, there's going to be bears, and whiskey is definitely safer than water. So that barrel runs dry, and you're like, okay, well, I need to distill some of these grains into whiskey. So you do everything that you did in the old country, but for some reason, the natural yeasts are different in the air and your fermentation doesn't start. So you try it a few more times in a few different places, and eventually your fermentation works the way it should, and you can make a beer and then distill that into whiskey. Now, what these brewers and distillers and these early people knew was that you could do something that was very similar to how you made sourdough bread. So you take a little bit of the distillate from the previous batch, and you throw that back into your fermentation. So that soured mash has got lots and lots of dead yeast cells, which are proteins and things like that, and enzymes. You've also got an acidity regulator in there, and it's a way of maintaining consistency. So just like in every batch of sourdough bread, you put in some of the starter, which is from the previous batch, and you keep this thing growing. That is how American whiskey, especially bourbons and ryes, have been made as a way to keep things consistent. But it dates back, 300 years to when people didn't actually know exactly the science behind it. So the question is, why is the sour mash called something different to the bourbon and the rye? Because all four of these whiskeys here do utilize the sour mash process. Now, if you can't put bourbon or rye on a label, it's probably because you've broken one of the rules or regulations which make it a bourbon or a rye. So the sour mash doesn't have enough corn in it to be a bourbon, and it doesn't have enough rye in it to be called a rye. So what else were they going to call it? They didn't want to call it rye bourbon blend. They didn't want to call it blended whiskey because that's something very different in America. Blended whiskey is seen as much, much cheaper whiskey, and it can contain a lot of neutral grain alcohol. So Michter's the original Michter's brand, back from the 1960s, 1970s, they were like, okay, well, we need to call it something. So what part of our production process should we call it? And also, what whiskeys are doing really, really well in the world at the moment? There was one that's called Old Number 7 that had sour mash emblazoned on the logo, made by Jack Daniels, and that was doing amazingly well. So Michter's, the original owners, were kind of like, well, okay, well, what can we call this that ties this to the Jack Daniels name? They couldn't call it Old Number 7 because that was definitely a lawsuit waiting to happen. So they decided on just calling the whiskey sour mash. So not enough corn to be a rye, not enough corn to be a bourbon, not enough rye to be a rye. They named it after the process, the sour mash process, and also it was kind of tying into Jack Daniels' success. So this is what the sour mash is. It's a blend or a middle ground between a bourbon and a rye. It's bottled at 43%. And the way I always describe it is it's something which drinks like a rye, but finishes like a bourbon. So you get this really beautiful kind of spicy note up front, but then on the finish and on the palate, it's really, really elegant and really, really smooth. So you've got this beautiful kind of marriage of the bourbon and the rye. And it's a bit more extreme spice than the bourbon, but it's a bit less spicy than the rye, if that makes sense. So it's a really nice middle ground between the two pillars. Hope that answered the question.
I think so. Going back to Rick, let's start with the Connecticut. Can you explain a little bit more about the flavor profile of the Connecticut, and then run into the natural and the Maduro?
Sure. You know, the Connecticut is probably an everyday smoke for me. It is a very mild smoke. It goes great with coffee in the morning, which is how I take it every single day. The Ecuadorian Connecticut wrapper is super nice. No real bitter notes. I don't know if anybody's smoking the Connecticut right now, but it is without a doubt one of the nicest Connecticut wrappers that I've ever smoked. This Ecuadorian Connecticut is super mild. The Dominican San Vicente binder adds a little bit of flavor to it, and then you've got, of course, the 5 secret tobaccos in the filler. But it's a great light smoke, goes great with wine, coffee, anything like that. Naked. Okay, you're asking Garrett something. As far as the natural is the next step up. It's kind of a medium-bodied smoke, really peppery. Got a lot of great leather and earthy tones to it. This Dominican hybrid wrapper is nice and dark and toothy. Got a little bit of oil to it. I love the flavor on that cigar simply because it is spicy. It gives you that deeper flavor profile that you're looking for. So when you're wanting something a little more hearty, that's a great cigar to reach for. The Maduro is like candy to me. I smoke the Maduro. I smoke the Maduro more than I do anything. And I have a hard time keeping them because, like I said earlier, they're just sweet tasting. And I haven't had sugar outside of the sugar in this bourbon in a very long time, 3 years probably. The sugar that I taste on the Maduro is fantastic. So if you're looking for something to go with rum, you're looking for something to go with a Sour Mash Bourbon, something that has little just hints of sweetness. You can pair it with even chocolates because it has a deep chocolatey flavor towards the last third of the cigar that is fantastic.
Where's the sweetness coming from?
Oh, the wrapper.
Yep.
Yeah, man, that Mexican San Andreas wrapper is super sweet. I love it.
And you mentioned in the beginning that you use Peruvian tobacco in the blend. What percentage of Peruvian would that be, roughly?
They won't tell me.
Okay.
It's in the filler. I don't know. It's in the, and it varies from cigar to cigar. It varies from, you know, the Connecticut to the Maduro to the natural. None of them are the same.
What
I
do
wouldn't
you think?
imagine I wouldn't imagine it's a high amount though.
Okay. What do you think adding Peruvian tobacco adds to the flavor of the cigar?
Earthiness.
That's it?
Just some, just some earthiness to it. I think it gives it earthy flavor.
Yeah.
You know, like a meaty, earthy flavor.
Okay. And then one which is not available in the UK is the Nicaragua. The Taco 7 Nicaragua, and that was initially not made by Davidoff, but by Indiana Otes.
Correct.
So how did that relationship come about? And what made you decide not to go with Davidoff initially on this one, but to go to Nicaragua?
We were approached a few years back by Indiana and her father. We've always done a little business with her father, Omar
Yep.
Ortez. Yeah, great man. They have a
Absolutely.
fantastic cigar family, great fields, great factory, and they still make cigars for us. But we were approached, and he told us basically, you know, my daughter has a blend. I want you to try it, and we tried it. It was beautiful. It really was beautiful. The wrapper on that cigar, the problem is that wrapper is also an Ecuadorian Connecticut that is aged 12 years. And it's a Desperado wrapper. meaning, you know, they cut it before it flowers, and the problem with that is limited supply.
Yep.
And because the brand is becoming larger, the demand is higher. So we needed to look at the overall brand picture and decide whether or not, because we knew eventually we were going to have to change it. And eventually, and this leads me to, you know, the new PSyKo Nicaragua, which is essentially another Davidoff product. We moved all of the manufacturing from Nicaragua to Dominican. They're still using Nicaraguan tobacco in the Dominican to make the cigar. And it is, again, a beautiful cigar. And I can't wait for you guys to try it. I feel like eventually I'm being swarmed with flies. I'm in my shop today. But I feel like eventually UK will have the Nicaraguan. I don't know the timeline on that. We'll have to discuss that offline.
Neither do I.
Yeah, we'll discuss that, and we'll figure that out. But you know, we have we're looking at expanding the brand. We do have a limitada that we are launching in August, September timeframe, which is a 7x40 Lancero. And
Yes.
it actually, I think it was born on the last Zoom call that
It
we
was
did.
born on the first Zoom call we did, I think,
Yeah,
with the UK.
Yeah, the PSyKo
Somebody
7
came up with the idea of the 7 deadly sins.
fuck yeah, the PSyKo 7 Deadly Sin. It's a fantastic name, and the guy came up. I don't even remember who it was. Paul, do you remember?
It was Robert Farrell.
Was it?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ,
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to send him some cigars.
It was like Robert from our Zoom call last year. Came
Yeah.
up with the seven deadly sins.
Exactly, yeah.
I need to send that man some cigars.
I know where he
Because-
lives. So that's all.
Okay, good. Because I'll tell you, after we got off that call, I was like, that is a fantastic name. So I did the trademark searches. We trademarked it. I called the factory. The cigar was born. It is, and I've smoked it. I don't know how many Lancero fans we have, but I'm telling you guys,
I think
this
quite a
one's
few.
real.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one's real. And I cannot wait to get it in your hands. We're only making 1,500 boxes initially that
Boxes
we
of
will
7.
split. Pardon me?
Boxes of 7.
Correct.
Yeah.
Boxes of 7. Yeah. So yeah, and I think I sent you the information
I
about
saw it earlier. Yeah, I saw it earlier today. Yeah, it looks amazing.
Yeah. It won't have that giant wrapper, James. So is James still here? James, it won't have that big wrapper like. So it's a little different because it is a limitada. So I can't wait to get it in your hands. It's just one of the most beautiful cigars I've smoked. And again, it's a Davidoff product.
We had a question from somebody earlier. If you don't smoke PSyKo, what do you smoke?
Who, me? Personally?
Yes. You personally, yeah. Especially in the US with the plethora of cigar brands to your disposal.
Yeah, I do. There are a lot of cigars, you know. And being in the cigar industry, I get a lot. People give me cigars a lot. Some of my favorite though, Plasencia.
Okay.
Alma Fuerte. That's a great cigar, guys.
It sure is. Have you tried the 601?
Yes. It's a fantastic cigar.
Very good.
I smoke a lot of Davidoff cigars, White Label. Any of the late hour Winston Churchills, they're fantastic cigars. I even smoke Rocky Patel. I mean, that's the thing. This is because I work for a company that sells every single brand. I have the benefit of being able to try all of the brands, right?
Yeah.
And and I don't care if it's a small boutique manufacturer. Each cigar manufacturer makes beautiful cigars. I mean, some are great, some are okay. I mean, it's the same with us. We've had some great cigars. We've had some, there's no sense in even just candy coating that. We just discontinued our archetype line. which I thought was, we had some beautiful cigars in that brand range, which I may bring back as a PSyKo 7 brand, because the FDA is so intrusive with the regulation
Of new blend. Yeah.
of new blends. So some of the cigars were fantastic. So we may see those again with a PSyKo 7 wrapper on them. I don't know. I mean,
Russ wants to see a 7x70.
No.
No. All right. We tried, Russ.
No.
We tried.
I will take two together for you.
Yeah. So with the 7 deadly sins, is there anything you can tell us about the blend? Or we just have to wait in?
The blend was developed off of the natural, the PSyKo 7 natural, with a few tweaks.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, just a few tweaks. The wrapper's a little different. It's an Ecuadorian Habano. And I will release some of that information a little closer to when we get ready to launch. But yeah, just the teaser is that Habano wrapper. Ooh, so good. So good. But it follows the same 7 tobaccos. By the way. Yeah.
Like I said, you went a bit more on brand, I guess, with having boxes of 7 now as well, instead of.
Well, I mean, look, I wanted boxes of 7. That was actually a big battle internally at our company. We were like, boxes of 7 or boxes of 10, and I'm like, guys, we can't do boxes of 10. There's only 7 deadly sins.
Exactly.
Unless if you come up with 3 more sins, which I'm sure I've committed at some point. I don't know, but we went with 7, and I think it works out better. It makes it more affordable. Makes it. I just think it flows better.
Perfect. So a couple of months wait. September.
Yeah, probably late August, September. We should have the product, or Europe should have the product. I hate saying this, but like end of June, second week of July. So, with COVID has slowed everything down.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I think we're all aware.
Yeah, it's been the last year and a half has been ridiculous. I mean, honestly, guys, I haven't traveled, and I was traveling 3 weeks a month. I haven't traveled in a year and a half.
You're still married?
Yes. Oh my God.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, wow. Actually, I've enjoyed my time with my family. Yeah. They've gotten to know me.
You're not that man who comes. You're not that man who comes on Sunday to cut the meat anymore.
No. I bring meat, but I'm not cutting it.
Yeah. Cool. Nathan. Sorry, Nathan. You want to talk about the last sampler?
Absolutely. So the last whiskey it's slightly different to everything else that we've tried today, and very different to pretty much all other American unblended whiskies. So we talked earlier about the barrels and the cost to Michters for the barrels. Now in bourbon and rye production and American whiskey production in general, you tend to use the barrel once. After it's been used once, you can no longer use it and call your product a bourbon or a rye or a straight whiskey or anything like that. And it's an old law that dates back, a couple of decades. And it was essentially there to make sure that, 1, the American forests got replanted, but 2, to provide jobs for the loggers and things like that. So this law is basically keeping the entire rum industry in supply of ex-bourbon barrels, the entire Scotch industry in supply of ex-bourbon barrels, the entire Tabasco and hot sauce industry, the Japanese whiskey industry. Basically, this is the glue that holds the global whiskey industry together in a lot of ways. Now, because it's so ubiquitous and there are so many bourbons being released every year, that means it's a huge amount of barrels. So it's very much a buyer's market. The seller doesn't really get to dictate how much they want for the barrel. So a air-seasoned, toasted, then charred Michter's barrel, which might have cost 5 to 10 times the production cost of a barrel that's just been kiln dried and charred. Michters don't see that money. These barrels basically go to a brokerage where the name of the casks is shaved off, and so you don't know which distillery you're getting a lot of the time. You end up with just an ex-bourbon barrel. So Michters decided that at some point, what's the point of just giving these barrels away and losing money on them? Obviously, legally, they can't reuse them and call it bourbon or rye. So this is where this kind of final nail in or basically the final product in the US #1 range comes in. So this is the Michter's American Unblended whiskey. Now, this is a bourbon mash bill. It's slightly different to the bourbon mash bill from before. I would say it's probably got a little bit more corn in there just based on the taste. But obviously Michters don't tell me. And every time I ask, they're like, don't talk about mash bills. So I'm like, okay, fine. So the Unblended American here, instead of using just new American oak, there's also a proportion of the distillate that is matured in old bourbon barrels that have previously held the Michter's 10-year-old bourbon. So these are bourbon soaked barrels, right? So for 10 years minimum, the wood has been lapping up this expensive distillate. A lot of it's going through the oak into the angel's share. And so it's already a really well-seasoned piece of oak or piece of wood. So as you're maturing the second time round, you get a lot less tannin coming through. So if you think about using a tea bag, right? The first time you use that tea bag, lots of color, lots of flavor comes out straight away. If you're to reuse that tea bag, you'll get color, you'll get some flavor, but it takes a bit longer. So, a lot of the flavor, a lot of the color, and a lot of the tannin comes out of these new American casks really quickly. So that means that the second time they're used for the rum industry, for the Scotch industry, for the Irish industry, they've softened a little bit. There's less bitterness sometimes, depending on how long the whiskey's been aged for, but you tend to get a lighter flavor during the maturation. So the more times you use the cask, the less active the cask is. So Michter's kind of blended this bourbon distillate into, some of their regular casks, but they also put some of it into these used casks. And what you end up with is a whiskey that's beautifully it's got a bit more sweetness to it. You've got a little bit less of that kind of spice coming through, but a really, really well-rounded digestif style whiskey. So my joke with my colleague Steph, who also works on the whiskey brands, it's always like, this is the whiskey that you choose when, you've probably had enough whiskey. So you've already had a couple of bourbons and someone says, you shouldn't have any more whiskey. I'm like, aha. What I will have, though, is the Michter's American Unblended, because it has these notes of cognac and Armagnac with that beautiful sweetness and richness that you've got coming from the corn. It's bottled at 41.7%, so it's a bit more approachable. And for me, this is, like I said, the kind of the digestif style of whiskey coming through here. Now, the name is a little bit different as well. So this is a Michter's small batch unblended American whiskey. So the term blended American whiskey, we don't see that in the UK because, obviously whiskey originated in here in Ireland, and because something originated here, it's always good to protect your interests and make sure that globally everyone is adhering to what whiskey needs to be. So if you're going to import a whiskey from Japan that is less than 3 years old, you can't call that a whiskey. You're going to do the same thing from America. You can't do that because whiskey by UK law has to be a minimum of 3 years old. So there is this category of whiskey that exists in America called blended American whiskey. Now, this is a similar kind of category to mixto agave spirits, mixto tequila, where you have a minimum of agave, so a minimum of 51% agave spirit, and then you can have 49% vodka. Now, American blended whiskey has to be 20% whiskey, 80% neutral grain spirit. So this is the stuff you see on the bottom shelf. If you go to a liquor store and it'll be in a big plastic jug or something like that, it's not always good quality. There are some good versions out there, but that's what an American blended whiskey is. So Michter's kind of approached the bourbon legislators and said, well, we've got this whiskey here we know it's not a bourbon. We're not going to try and call it a bourbon because, we've obviously broken one of the laws of what a bourbon whiskey is. But we don't feel that this is in the same category, quality-wise as an American blended whiskey. So the bourbon legislator said, well, yeah, okay, we give you that. And so Michter's then said, well, can we call it unblended American whiskey? And there was no no legislation for an unblended American whiskey. So that's why it's called the American or the Unblended American, because
I love that.
It's great, right? I mean,
That is a great idea.
it's showing innovation, which is, you know, in American whiskey, quite a difficult thing to do in those parameters, because there are so many. You don't have Madeira finished bourbons. You don't have, you know, sherry cask releases of rye whiskey. I mean, you can, but you can't call them rye whiskey or bourbons anymore.
Right.
So this legislation means that it's quite difficult to be really innovative within that framework. So this was one of Michter's kind of, you know, amazing ideas, just being like, well, we want to show what a used cask will do to a bourbon whiskey, and we're not going to call it a bourbon, but all of the same quality controls have gone into this as well. So for me, this is a really, really interesting kind of dive into what would be a bourbon if we just change one category. So if we just lighten up the wood a little bit, and it really lets the distillate sing, and you end up with these beautiful, elegant, soft notes to it as well. So, I mean, if anyone's got any questions on that one, obviously jump in, put it on the chat. There was just one kind of thing I really want to mention with Michter's, which is always one of my favorite things to talk about. It's definitely on the geekier side of things, but I think it's a really interesting concept, and one of the key reasons why Michter's has the texture and the sweetness and also the smoothness that it does. And it's to do with the ABV at which Michter's go into the barrel. So a couple of decades ago, you know, the bourbon regulators were realizing that, you know, if they didn't cap the maximum ABV to go into the barrel, there would be people who were just trying to produce as much bourbon as possible that might go into the barrel at, say, 80 proof, well, 80%, sorry, so 160 proof, which is the maximum you're allowed to distill to. Otherwise, it's not a bourbon or a rye.
Right.
Now, Kentucky's in a slightly different position geographically to Scotland. I mean, in terms of the climate, it's very, very different. In Scotland, what tends to happen with the aging process, and most Scotch distilleries go into the barrel around 61 to 63% ABV. Now, believe it or not, Scotland is a really, really humid place to be. You don't notice it because it's normally too cold for you to notice you're sweating. So because it's so humid, there's already loads and loads of water that's in the air. Now, when the whiskey is aging and maturing, you have the angel's share that's coming out of the cask. Now, if you've already got loads of water in the air outside the cask, the thing that's going to evaporate to equalize that is going to be the alcohol coming out of the cask to level it up. So the ABV in Scotland, as you age, goes down. So a 50-year-old whiskey might get down to, say, 41% from 61 naturally. So you're not only losing whiskey, you're losing the alcohol from the whiskey, which is ridiculous. In Kentucky, it's flipped. So Kentucky is dry. It's hot and dry in the summer and cold and dry in the winter. So because there's no water in the air, water is easier to evaporate, or it's easier to go through this kind of semi-permeable membrane, which is the barrel. So you end up with water vapor evaporating first because it's moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So the whiskeys go up in ABV. So there are some whiskeys that say might have gone into the barrel at 60% or 60, 70% ABV. And after 5-6 years of aging, this is a very extreme case, it might have come out at 80% ABV. Now, if you're going to bottle that spirit at 40% ABV or 80 proof, you can add 50% or equal parts of water and whiskey, and you've got yourself an 80 proof bourbon. So you're paying for half of the whiskey in that bottle and half for the water. So that didn't really seem like a fair thing to do for a lot of the Kentucky distillers and for the legislators. So they said the maximum ABV that you can go into the barrel is 62.5%. Now, if anyone's tasted releases like the George T. Stagg and those sort of Buffalo Trace antique collections, you'll notice some of them are 74, 75% ABV, where they've gone up from 62.5 and they're bottled at barrel strength. Now, if you were willing to sort of, you know, go in at 62.5, you might still get up to 75, which means you can still add a lot of water. The Michters realized that if they went into the barrel at a slightly lower ABV, there's some really interesting barrel chemistry that happens. The first thing that happens is obviously the cost shoots up because you've got more liquids that you need more barrels to fill, which need more spaces in the warehouse, in the rick house. But in terms of the actual chemistry, Sugar is what we're trying to dissolve from the wood into the whiskey. That is the sugars in there, the lactones, the lignins, the hemicellulose and the cellulose layers are all going to give us really nice wood sugars, which are going to turn the whiskey darker and give us those vanilla, butterscotch, caramel flavors. Now, those sugars are much more soluble in lower concentrations of ethanol. So if you go in at a lower ABV, it's almost like you coax the sugars out and they're more ready to dissolve into the liquid. Now, Michter's goes in pretty much the lowest ABV of any distillery that's of scale. There will be micro distilleries and craft distilleries that are going in at 46% and things like that. But for Michter's, 51.5% was pretty close to the old ways of doing it back from the 60s and the 70s when the original Michter's was doing really well. So by going into the barrel at 51.5, they extract more sugars, which is great. But it also means that Michter's comes out of the barrel at around 55, 56%, sometimes lower. So the amount of water that hasn't had any aging is really minimal when it comes to a bottle of Michter's. So more of the whiskey in your bottle has actually been in contact with that barrel the entire time. Whereas if you had something that went in at 62.5 and then came out at 80, you've got 50% whiskey and 50% water in that bottle. So by adding the water before maturation, you're ending up with a more integrated, more aligned, and more refined, and basically slightly sweeter spirit, but it's all done through natural ways. And this is something Michter's do across their entire range. Everything goes in at 51.5. Everything goes in toasted, charred barrels that have had air-seasoned oak. And then it's just really the mash bill that changes on what the whiskeys are. And obviously with the last whiskey we've tasted, it's those used casks again.
Wow.
Perfect.
Yeah. This has been just a master class in bourbon and whiskey, Nathan.
Well, thank you very much. And it's all through Michter's.
Oh, man. I feel like a letdown.
Not at all. I mean, I'll be smoking these cigars later on this evening with a glass of Michter's for sure. But honestly, if anyone ever finds themselves in Kentucky, drop by the Michter's distillery. If you want to go to the actual distillery, it's in Shively. And anyone that's ever bought a bottle of Michter's is considered Michter's family. So they'd be always happy to host. And if anyone is in Louisville and downtown Louisville, you can go to the Michter's Fort Nelson distillery, which is the old, they've got the original pot stills from Shanks from 1753. And it's right opposite the Louisville Slugger factory as well. So you can go to the baseball bat,
exactly where it is.
And you can go and get some whiskey and bottle your own cask strength or barrel strength bourbon as well.
I'm ready to do that.
Sounds like a plan indeed.
Yeah.
So any fun facts from you, Rick, on PSyKo 7?
Oh my God, I think I've told
Top it off.
I don't know if I can follow that. Any of this. I'm like, that's just like a science lesson. Who was it that said that?
I think it was
said that it was a science lesson? Yeah, Cigar Guys. Yeah, this was a science lesson. This was wonderful. I don't have any really cool PSyKo 7 information like that. I feel like a letdown now. That's tough to follow, Nathan.
Well, you've done all right so far. So yeah.
Well, but I will say this: who likes knives and guns?
There's the American coming out.
Mm-hmm. I hand forge. I'm a blacksmith on the side.
Yeah,
I do it for fun. I blacksmith my own knives, and this is one blank that I've hand forged. I mean, I have lots. I'm in my knife shop right now. Knives and guns. So this is where I clean my guns and work on knives. Outside of that, there's actually, I'll tell you a funny story, Alistair, about the Forged in Fire. About 3 years ago, they sent me an invitation to come on the show. And my father was dying of stage 4 lung cancer at the time. And I had to turn it down. And I told him, I said, I would love to do this some other time, maybe. And I've never heard from them again, so whatever. But yeah, you need to get some Michter staves. Oh, I missed the rest of it. Who said that?
Mike, whiskey wings. You need to get some Mitch's staves for handles.
Oh, I've done that.
Staves off the barrels.
We have a distillery in the town that's about 30 miles from me. It's a small distillery. Their whiskey's not great, but they're great. They're good people. And they asked me to make them a knife with whiskey stave handles, and I did. So if you want to look at my knives, New Camp Knives on Instagram. New Camp Knives on Instagram.
That's a question. Are they pattern welded or spring stock?
Well, I do both. I do pattern weld. I don't do it a lot. Only when, I mean, every knife I make is custom ordered. People ask me all the time for crazy knives. And I will make a pattern welded knife. It takes longer. It's harder. I don't have a lot of machinery. I mean, I've got an anvil and a forge. So, you know, the only power hammer I have is, right there. So they are more difficult. But they're beautiful. Pattern welded knives are beautiful. Damascus, Sanmai, you name it, I can do it all.
Well, on that note, unless anybody has any more questions for Nathan and Rick.
I don't know. I have more bourbon though.
There we are. If not, then we'll finish off the session. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Nathan, for joining on behalf of
Hang on, Russ.
Drinks, and your knowledge on Mitch's has been inspiring for a lot of people, I think. So
Russ,
thank you very
much for having me.
Russ made a comment. Russ, I have had so many people ask me to make a cutter. And I don't know whether to make a scissor cutter or a knife cutter with, I forget the company that makes them. With it looks like a knife. Huh? Yeah. And I've thought about doing it, but I only have a few people asking me for them. And the tooling required to make something like a cigar scissor, whoa. Yeah, that would be difficult, man. Especially, I mean, that's not such a precision tool.
Well, something to keep in mind, you know. Make a prototype.
Well, I've tried a couple times and it's ugly. I'll be honest.
You can always go for the 7 deadly knives.
Yeah. 7 deadly knives. That sounds like a Chinese kung fu movie.
A little bit.
Yeah, 7 deadly knives. I want to thank everybody. Nathan.
Oh, thank you.
Nathan, this has been an experience for me as well. I was excited to log into this simply to speak to you. Nathan, please hook me up with a visit to Michter's. I will
definitely do that for you.
I've already introduced the two of you via email just now, so you've got each other's details.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks for that, Roy. And thanks everyone for joining as well. I mean, it's always a pleasure to come and do these things, and hopefully we can do it in person at some point soon as well. We just have to travel a bit more, you know.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
So I have another meeting, like a real meeting, at 4 o'clock. Do I keep drinking or do I stop now?
It's too late to stop. You need to keep going.
Yeah, I don't know.
Tea needs help, I always find, especially if they're made with Miktas.
Yeah, right. It was a pleasure, guys. If any of you, hey, James, get with Roy. Send me your info. I will send you some placements, okay? I don't want you having a bad experience at my account. Unmute yourself, damn it.
The cigar was beautiful. It was beautiful.
Perfect.
It was the Maduro, correct?
Yes. The red.
Maduro's a great cigar, man.
It was awesome. It smoked awesome. I just wanted to get a rise. I just wanted to get my say.
I need more people in Europe to smoke the Maduro.
Okay. I'll do my best to oblige.
More people in Europe should smoke the Maduro. It gets less love. And I think it's because of Maduros in the past. But this one is beautiful. It's a great experience.
I don't normally go for them, to be honest. But that was beautiful, yeah. It's actually finished now, which is disappointing. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Buy
Jesus,
more.
I
All's
smoked two
over. The
cigars.
cigar's done. Where do I go now?
I've smoked 2 cigars, a Toro and a Gordo, a 6x60. I'm like, oh. So I've been smoking hard.
At least I've not got a meeting to attend. So I
No,
can be thankful for that.
yeah, what is it? It's 3:33 here right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I've got to
It was
put my
lovely.
I have to
Sorry.
put my professional face on.
Absolutely awesome cigars and awesome whiskies. Thank you.
I agree. The
So,
whiskey's
quality.
fantastic. The cigars are great. You can't beat the combination.
Mm-hmm. True.
I've been doing Michters and PSyKo 7 for 5 years in a row. So you guys get on the bandwagon.
Keep going.
Yeah, get on the bandwagon. Looking forward to cutting a 7x70. Russ, stop it. We're not going to do a 7x70. I will talk to my friend Tom Lazuka
Oh, yeah, silent.
at CLE and get him. They have a
Yeah.
7x70. Well, actually, don't they have?
No, there was talk about a
80
9x90.
Yeah, I think they have an 80 gauge.
Yeah, they're an 8x80, but I think they were talking about a 9x90.
How do you smoke that?
I have no idea.
That's a
I'm
Monica.
not going to find
Lewinsky.
out, that's for sure.
That's a Monica Lewinsky right there.
Paul, any last words?
Just to say thank you to everyone. Rick, much appreciated for your time this evening. It's great to see the PSyKo 7s. Looking forward to the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah, how many do you want?
Release. There's only 1,500 boxes. Make sure that the UK gets a good allocation because we came up with the branding on our call 12 months ago.
I agree.
Thank you. Also to Nathan, it's been a wealth of knowledge that you shared this evening.
Absolutely.
And I put the links into the chat box for all of our Mikta's products and also the PSyKo 7s. Appreciate your time. Roy, thanks again from the studio
Pleasure.
outside.
Yeah.
And you can go to the website, CGars.com, look up all of our future virtual Herfs. Look forward to welcoming you all in future events. Thanks, everyone.
Sounds good.
No, thanks. Thanks to all of you.
Cheers. Yeah, cheers to that.